guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in today for Kirby Anderson, who will be back shortly. But we have got an exciting 2 hours for you today. In our second hour, we're going to go to Dr. Dan Garretson. He's an expert in space issues, and especially how the private sector is increasingly becoming involved and leading the way in space exploration, how the federal government's beginning to trust primarily in the private sector to make sure that our space program is on track and leading the world. But in this first hour, I'm excited to talk with Secretary Lisa Hershman. She started her career as a young engineer for GE Aerospace, working on the Seawolf submarine program. She eventually became the third highest-ranking official in the Pentagon. Secretary Hershman has spent her career driving innovation, transformation, and results in the Fortune 100 and government, while breaking through glass ceilings and stereotypes along the way. She eventually became the chief management officer at the Department of Defense, and that's what we're here to talk to her about. Secretary Hershman, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Merrill. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of your wonderful segment, and I'm really being here today.
Well, we're looking forward to this. Now, as I mentioned, you started your career as an engineer at GE. Tell me what got you interested in moving towards engineering?
Well, good question. All through high school, I gravitated more towards the math and science curriculums and programs. I seem to not only be interested in it, but thanks to one father who was a wonderful analytical and critical thinker who spent lots of time, and my dad had a background in finance. Mm-hmm. I just seemed to be those subjects. And, I became very interested in learning more. I became more interested in science invention, and so I gravitated toward those subjects. And I honestly thought when I was a child that I would be an innovator, and then as I got into high school, absolutely could picture myself being a scientist in a laboratory. And so that to college, I actually started as a chemistry major and was very interested in the engineering side. So the wonderful school I went to, Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York, actually required to take 2 semesters of every engineering curriculum to broaden our horizons and give us a little experience in each of the curriculum. So it was very beneficial for me.
Now, you were nominated by President Trump to be the chief management officer at the Department of Defense, and you were confirmed unanimously in the Senate, which is unusual these days. How did you get on the president's radar screen for this type of work?
Well, Dad was my hero, and he served in the Navy before he was GE, and my dad wanted to country. And, regretted a little when I was younger. I actually didn't join the military, and so I have always been seeking that I might be able to contribute to our nation, maybe using my background. And so I saw the advertisement or the opening, and it was something specific to my background because of the requirement to have private sector business experience. Mm-hmm. But I simply did like everybody. I submitted my resume, and I submitted it caught the attention of Secretary Mattis, and he thought I was uniquely qualified. And shortly after submitting resume, I received a call with Secretary Mattis's chief of staff. So that's how it sort of came about. It was simply through taking a chance my resume via the website.
Interesting. Now, as you mentioned, you didn't have a military background. Did that create a barrier or a problem for you working in the Pentagon?
That's a fair question, because I will tell you, my first day in the Pentagon, it was quite interesting. There are 25,000 people that were there. And unlike some of my fellow appointees, I actually knew each other from maybe a previous administration. And I, as you said, I never served, I never worked in the government. However, what I did have the benefit of is working in the private sector. I worked in global roles. So I've had the privilege of working in places like Singapore and Germany and Japan and China. And I was able to draw from that experience and say to myself, this is just like going into another country. And if anybody's been in the Pentagon, you'll understand what I mean. First of all, it's huge. As I mentioned, 25,000 people work there. Mm-hmm. And if you walked all of the corridors, you'd cover over 17 miles. So it's big. There's lots of people. And there's a very wonderful, unique culture. Just like other countries, they have their own customs, they have their own language, they speak an acronym. And so I took the approach of treating it like I was visiting another country and immersed myself into the customs and the cultures. And I think that helped quite a bit. Additionally, I was really pleasantly surprised at how many people in the Pentagon were very interested in how the private sector worked, because many of them have never experienced that. So we had a chance to collaborate on different experiences and find those commonalities, which was very helpful.
Do you have a sort of a guess as to how many people working in the Pentagon were private sector versus military, some kind of rough percentage?
I don't, but I would say the vast majority have not been in the private sector. Many of my fellow appointees had been, but I would say for the population that are full-time permanent government employees, the majority of them had not.
Okay. My guest for this hour is Secretary Lisa Hershman. She was the Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense, appointed by President Trump. She's got an interesting story about looking for inefficiencies and money that she was able to save the federal government, taxpayers, in her work there. So if you want to know, find out more about Lisa, you can always go to our website, pointofview.net. We have information up there on her, a Twitter handle, I think, and some other things, so you can always reach out to her. But we'll be coming back. When we come back, we want to find out exactly what does a chief management officer do, and how was she able to take that and to bring some efficiencies to the Pentagon, which I think almost anybody would say this is one of the largest bureaucracies in the country. Anyone would see that as a challenge. Lisa, stay with us. We'll be back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
President Biden pledged to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of this decade and to reach a goal of carbon zero by 2050. Even if we assume that it is necessary to address climate change, what would be the impact on our country? Anyone who criticizes such measures is usually tagged as a climate change denier. But David Harsanyi talks about another denial. He refers to it as Biden's climate denialism. The president and his policymakers are in denial about what it would take to hit such targets. Here are a few facts. Most of America's energy is generated by fossil fuels and nuclear. A much smaller amount comes from renewable sources such as wind, solar, and hydropower. We aren't going to reach the administration's goals by merely walking, riding bicycles, and turning down our thermostats. It will require that we eliminate gas-powered cars, retrofit homes and buildings, and rebuild the nation's electrical grid. Here's another way to look at the immense of the problem. The pandemic and lockdown last year did reduce our country's greenhouse emissions. The best estimate is that it only reduced carbon emissions by 5%. You can imagine what a 50% reduction would entail. Of course, this country actually only accounts for about 15% of global CO2 emissions. Also, emissions in the U.S. and Europe have been falling since 2005. By contrast, the rising emissions from China have swamped these declines, and China is building more coal-fired plants every day. Proponents say the president's goals are technologically feasible and well within our reach. That is simply not true. It will be hugely expensive and massively disruptive. The president is in denial about the magnitude of his climate goal. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And with me on the phone is Secretary Lisa Hershman, who was the Chief Management Officer for the Department of Defense. So, Lisa, what is a Chief Management Officer? What does that person do?
Good question. So first of all, for the Department of Defense, it was the number 3 ranked person in the entire organization and the senior official in charge of reform. So if you think about business operations across all of DOD, the Chief Management Officer had jurisdiction and authority over all of those processes and operations. And then, of course, I was tasked with finding inefficiencies and savings so that money was, number one, well spent, and to ensure that we had money to direct toward some of our higher priorities. So in general, that's what the Chief Management Officer role encompassed.
Now, I asked you about your military background, which you didn't have one, but as you mentioned, this is primarily military people there, and it has been dominated by males over the years. Did your coming in as a female, did that create any problems, or did that work fine? I really didn't have any problems as a female, but that doesn't mean I didn't have pushback. I would say that the biggest challenges had more to do about, number one, my role, because driving reform means demanding and creating change comfortable for people. And the other area where it was less friendly, I'll say, was the thought that because I came exclusively from the private sector, and by the way, the job description mandated that there was more pushback there because there was an assumption that I couldn't connect with what they were doing at the Department of Defense, which was not the case, which we proved out over time. But that was initially the pushback came from my desire to drive change and coming from a completely different industry. Now, you came from a business background, and you were working to try to create efficiencies and innovation in business. In fact, I think you did a book, 2010, 2011, Faster, Cheaper, and Better, which our listeners can find. If they go on Amazon, there are copies of that available there. But so now you're going from business to the government, and not just the government, but the Pentagon. Is the Pentagon, is it a business? Can it be run like a business or affected like a business?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but if you ask the folks working at DOD, they say it's not a business, but they can try to say that, but it's not the case. There are so many similarities to business. There's income, there are expenses, there are customers, there are shareholders. The biggest argument I used to get is, yes, but we don't have a profit motive. Mm-hmm. And I was eager to challenge that thinking and say, maybe you should, because this is being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and anything we save can be redirected into higher priorities and emerging threats. But even there are things that people don't necessarily realize about the types of businesses within the business of DoD that we run. We have grocery stores that we call commissaries. We have a tremendous amount of research and engineering that happens. We run universities, hospital systems. My team even ran 2 retirement homes. So there are a lot of similarities if you look at the components of the Department of Defense.
And it's an important point because the Department of Defense is a huge, sprawling agency covering all kinds of things.
Yes, that's correct. And as I mentioned, I mean, we can connect to so many private sector, either businesses or departments, just like many of your listeners who go to work and you have an HR department and you have an IT department, and we have the same things, huge procurement. The folks that in the private sector call purchasing, we have a massive procurement system in place that buys everything from orange juice and Band-Aids and batteries to F-35s. So there are many of the business operations are identical to what we see in the private sector. Just the scale is a bit different.
I can imagine. Now, before we get into what you tried to accomplish while you were there, you left in January, I assume with the leaving of the Trump administration. Has somebody filled that job, taken that job that you left behind?
So you're correct. I left when there is a change of administration. By law, all the appointees' jobs come to an end at noon on January 20th. So as we were ushering in and welcoming in a new administration, all of us appointees left. And unfortunately, no one did take my place because Congress had decided to eliminate the position, which was a bit of a surprise. But in some respects, not too surprising. Look, we were driving a massive amount of change, and we were requiring people to think differently. My entire team was disruptive in terms of rethinking business operations and even business models. We had a lot of folks that were excited about the work we were doing. Head of the Space Force, General Raymonds, came to me and said, Lisa, I want to take private sector approach to standing up Space Force, which was exciting. But unfortunately, those that did not want to be reformed were the ones that were asked to weigh in on the CMO position. Sadly, those that were impacted the most, the warfighter and the taxpayer, were never surveyed about the effectiveness and whether or not to keep the role.
So what did you find when you arrived on the job? Were there a lot of things to be done, a few areas to focus on? What did you see when you got there?
It was a target-rich environment.
to use a military term.
That's exactly right. There was lots to be done, and what was really overwhelming was in the beginning was getting my head wrapped around the scale. I remember my first week or two there, I was very excited to find $65 million in savings. And I remember the room of people looking at me and they said, we find that in the couch cushions here. So I had to quickly get up to speed on scale. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We had 22 different contracts for buying 2x4s. We have over 300 business systems just to manage financial transactions. While most private companies have one cloud initiative, we have 355. That's driven from 64 CIOs. And when I arrived, the Department of Defense had never had a chief data officer. So, I mean, these are contracts when we put out requests for quote. for maybe a part, they're over 300 pages long, and you may not find the specification for that part until somewhere north of page 100 or 200. So, like I said, target-rich environment.
Were you given the authority, the power to be able to implement these changes?
I was, and that was the benefit of being the number 3 in the department. I had the authority, and when it came to business operations, I had full authority to overrule Secretary of the Army and the Navy, et cetera. But the good news was I had great partners that many of them also came from the private sector, and I didn't have to do that. What was the most limiting in my effectiveness was I was never given a budget to drive any reform. And for those who have worked in the space, you have to change training, change the way you do things, invest in new ways, new technology, and I was never given a budget. And that was one of the biggest barriers that I faced.
What would you have done with a budget?
Oh, I would have turned we had $43 billion in savings. We had already booked $37 billion, and when I left, there was another $6.2 billion sitting on the table. I could have easily doubled that.
When we come back, I'd like you to sort of highlight what you were able to save with that $33 billion. Give us some examples of that, and explain a little bit about how difficult that process was. Our guest this hour, Secretary Lisa Hershman. She was the Chief Management Officer of the Department of Defense, appointed by President Trump, and left that when he left office. And we're talking about all the issues that she faced as Chief Management Officer. If you'd like to talk to Lisa, have a question for her or a comment, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. You can find out more about Lisa going to the Point of View website. We have information there about her. And she also has a book that you could go to Amazon. It's several years old, but it highlights the innovation she was able to bring to business. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And my guest right this hour is Secretary Lisa Hershman, former Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense. And Lisa, you were talking about being able to save, I think, $33 billion, you said. What did that entail? Where were you able to find those savings?
Yes, actually it was $43 billion, and just for your listeners, if you took $43 billion and wrapped it end to end, it would circle the globe 172 times. So this is a lot of money, and we were able to find it in a variety of areas. Number one, we have a tremendous procurement organization. We have 45,000 contracting officers and 2,500 contracting offices. We buy everything from orange juice and batteries to large weapon systems. And by looking at things like having 27 different brands of apple juice that we sell in our commissaries, and organizing and consolidating and leveraging those contracts, we were able to garner a lot more buying power and save a lot of money. And then we'd asked ourselves, do we really need 27 brands? And when we looked at the data, we saw that 7 of them are the big sellers. As a matter of fact, when we looked at all of our grocery stores, we found that there were 1.4 million item numbers that the stores carried, but 1 million of those items never produced more than $1,000 of revenue a year. So those were some of the areas. Another area was in regulatory reform, where it wasn't necessarily a money improvement, but it was about an efficiency and effectiveness with regulatory issues. We looked at 716 regs and found 243 of them could either go away completely or be modified. So we looked at efficiencies, we looked at effectiveness. We were able to help even take down timeline, reduce multi-year implementation of advanced weapon systems that would help our men and women that are in the field, where we might be having a next generation weapon system. We could implement it 2 and 3 years earlier because we reviewed the project, did some different negotiations, and made timeline changes. So it wasn't just about the dollars, but it was also about how do we help the men and women who serve this country? How do we make their lives better? And how do we help them protect us?
We're going to go to Alex in Georgia in just a minute. But, Lisa, we've heard stories for years that government agencies tend not to want to see their budgets cut, or they want to spend all the money they're allotted so that their budgets aren't cut and they're able to go and ask for more money. If you're coming in and you're saying we're looking for ways to cut money here, cut budgets here, or cut spending here and there, did you get some pushback just from people who said, if you end up cutting our spending, our budget's going to go down and we're not going to have as much as we need?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. What we did, though, was in working directly with the different secretaries of defense, is we said, look, we're going to use that money, and every dime that we saved went to higher priorities because, let's be candid here, we're not always going to be fighting our traditional adversaries like China and Russia. We have new domains where we're receiving threats, cyber, biological. And so we need to make sure that money saved is money reinvested to continue to protect this country. And so it was moving of money rather than, and yes, some felt it was that they were being cut, but we were moving it to higher priority needs.
Okay, let's go to Alex in Georgia. Alex, you're on the air.
Thank you, sir, for letting me on. Hey, I am Alex Dixon. I was a person farsi linguist in the Air Force, and I served for 15 years. My entire career, I was offered re-enlistment bonuses, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, in the long run, do you think it's worth it to offer bonuses to these soldiers, to airmen, when the motivation for joining the military isn't for money, but to serve?
Good, Alex. We'll get an answer. Lisa?
Alex, yeah,
I'm sorry?
Alex, first of all, thank you for your service. I really appreciate you serving your country in that way. And you're right. And this was actually part of our reform initiatives, was not just to look at the monetary transactions, but we need to invest in talent, people like yourself. And we need to take the time to understand what motivates having someone like you join up and serve your country. We found that even within the department, as times are changing and there is a need for different skill sets, it's not about the money always. In fact, we were able to recruit some fantastic data scientists from big companies and recruit them away because, number one, they wanted to be part of a national mission. They wanted to serve their country. They had a patriotic calling. And number two, well, actually, that's more than two, but they also wanted to work on problem solving and looking at problems and solving problems that were very complex. Maybe it was where they were in their career. And so I said to them, you come work for us. We've got complex problems all over the place. So we could appeal to tapping into their talents and making sure that that they were being valued and that they were creating value. So that I agree with you. I think we need to delve in a little bit deeper than just the monetary entice you in other ways other than just the money.
Thank you, Alex. Good question. Lisa, you mentioned the data services there, and I haven't seen an article on this in a couple of years, but for a while there were articles about the Veterans Administration, the VA, trying to get a system up where they could have the medical records of their various veterans in there, such that they could share it among the hospitals and so forth. And if I remember right, the last article I saw, they had spent something like $1.5 billion and still hadn't gotten the system up and working. And this reminds me, when the Affordable Care aspect came out, the Affordable Care Program, Obamacare, the website was crashing and so forth. And President Obama finally stood up and said, well, the government doesn't do technology well. Was your experience that you could take data services and other things and can get the government to do technology well?
Yeah, that's a more complicated question than you might think, because we have overcomplicated some of our technology systems. And again, I'm speaking for DOD, but many of my colleagues that were in other agencies had the same situation. I mentioned earlier in the show that we had at DOD 64 CIOs. Each of them had budgets. Each of them had authorities to implement. And what happens is it becomes a very complicated system with redundancies and also systems that don't necessarily talk to one another. And then as you're trying to link, because we were working closely with the VA on the medical records, we had teams trying to bring these two organizations together. And so with the complexity of each of them, it wasn't that easy. And, that takes a lot of time. There's a lot of review. The government spends a lot of time doing business case analysis and doing analysis on these kind of initiatives, which adds to time. But I will also say that the government has a very different viewpoint on how long technology implementation should take. By way of example, we had one agency spending $1.6 billion on a new IT system. And if you had a company the same size of that agency in the private sector, it would have cost half. The government's timeline for that is 18-year implementation. And in the private sector, it would take 3 to 5. Now, anybody listening knows that technology doesn't survive 18 years. The day they go live, it will be obsolete. And that's part of the problem and the shift in thinking that needs to happen, which is why I applaud those who support government and private sector collaboration because it makes for better outcomes.
1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to talk to Secretary Lisa Hershman in our closing segment here, we've got one more segment. When we come back, I want to find out how the Department of Defense, how what we perceive as the threats to us are changing. Is it still land battles and hand-to-hand fighting, or are we looking more at cyber warfare and other types of challenges that we're seeing more of and yet may or may not be ready? I'm be interested to find out what Secretary Hershman has to say about that. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Secretary Lisa Hershman, former Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense. So, Lisa, is the market change? I mean, is the challenge of defense changing over time? And are we putting our resources in the right places?
And it is absolutely changing, and that time period for overtime is becoming shorter. We are used to traditional land, sea, and air defense, which is not going away, by the way. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing is the emergence of new fighting domains, particularly in cyber and also biological. And so these are areas in which we need to make sure, number one, we're getting good intel. And number two, we're investing properly to be able to effectively defend our country. And so those two areas are emerging domains.
That raises the question because Democrats are in control of the budget process now. Many of them would like to cut the defense budget or at least slow the rate of growth of the defense spending. What do you think of those ideas? Do we need can we do more with less, or do we need more resources out there?
Well, I think it bears the question of, are we spending our resources in a prudent way? Are we taking what we know from our intel and looking at the data and saying, this is where we need to ramp up investments, and this is where maybe we need to slow things down? For instance, we used to have a huge issue with IEDs, no longer much of a threat except in certain parts of certain continents. And so as that diminishes, doesn't it make sense to take resources, whether it's people or budget or both, and shift them maybe into hypersonic research, which is where the direction is going in terms of the future? So it's not necessarily a matter of increases or cuts. It's we need to look at what are our top priorities, what are our biggest threats, and are we making the most effective use of the dollars that we are given? And that's where I think the big challenge is. And with the amount of redundancies and even some of the examples I shared with your listeners today, we can do a better job.
Now, you mentioned some of the emerging threats, but one of the emerging threats I'm hearing from the White House is climate change. They're saying that's a national security issue. They're wanting to get the Pentagon more involved. When President Obama was in there, if I remember right, the Secretary of the Navy was looking to try to use biofuels or other types of fuels to move the destroyers and the fleets. It just seemed like an odd place. In fact, I think the Navy was looking at buying a refinery so that they could refine some of those things themselves. Do you see climate change as a near-term threat for us, like cyber warfare and other things?
So it's good. It's a fair question, difficult for me to answer because this really started to garner more attention as I was leaving office. But I would say that, number one, data matters and the facts matter. And I think it warrants looking at new ways of defending our country as long as we understand what the threats and the impacts are. But you brought up fuel usage, for example. As I was leaving, I was working with Secretary Briette from the Department of Energy to rethink the way government as a whole, starting with DOD, buys fuel. DOD is used to buying refined fuel such as jet fuel, and we were thinking what would happen if we bought crude, and would we be able to make more efficient and more effective use of those dollars and then be able to supply to all of government. So I absolutely think it's worth looking into different methods of getting the supply that we need, but also looking at the data on how real the threat is and how it might threaten us.
Now, you're no longer at the Department of Defense, and they eliminated that position. But if you were still there, if President Trump had won a second term, what would you be focusing on now that you would think would be the key aspects that that would demand your attention?
Well, it would be wonderful to continue the work we started and scale it. So expanding our work not only within the Department of Defense, but we got a lot of attention from other agencies that said, teach us what you're doing because the results you're getting are staggering. So we would continue the work, but we would focus on, number one, changing the way we work. There is this this predetermined position that, well, we can't change policies and we can't change our practices. Not only can we, but we need to keep up with changing demands and needs. We started looking at business models. I mentioned Space Force, with looking at not do things the traditional way and how can we learn from the private sector. There was also a lot of focus on upskilling our resources because what I found is folks within the Department of Defense were woefully behind the times in new techniques and methodologies. And so being able to give these folks new skills and training, I think, is really important. And then finally, and it came a little bit from Alex's question, is how do we recruit talent? There is some need out there that we need to be able to entice people. He was right. We don't always have the money that the private sector can throw at talent, but we have other things that can entice them. So I think those are some of the areas that we would have liked to focus even more. And
in our closing minutes, take about a minute to tell us, are there other chief management officers at other agencies? And if not, would they be beneficial in departments like Health and Human Services, Veterans Affairs, and some of those?
In a word, absolutely. So it's a shame that the CMO position was eliminated from DOD, and I know there's several very interested members of Congress who are seeking to bring it back and make sure that it's supported with funding and resources. All the other agencies have chief performance officers, but they don't have the authority and the clout that the role at DOD had, and that is absolutely necessary to drive meaningful change. So I think it's a great idea. It is much more common in the private sector, and it's working there. So it's not as if DOD has to do an experiment. They can benchmark industry and see how well it works.
My guest for this hour has been Secretary Lisa Hershman. She's the former Chief Management Officer at the Pentagon, the number 3 ranking official at the Department of Defense, and used that position to bring efficiencies and other things that she had learned in the private sector to the Department of Defense. And as we found out, she left during at the end of the Trump administration, and that position isn't there anymore. And I think we're worse off for it. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa.
Merrill, thank you so much for having me. It was enjoyable.
Thank you. And if you want to find out more about Lisa, you can go to pointofview.net. We have information up there about her, and you can also look for her book on Amazon. It's about 10 years old, but you can go there and find a copy of it. When we come back, we're changing gears, but not that much. Lisa mentioned Space Force. We've got Dr. Dan Garretson coming in. He is going to be talking about space, and especially the private sector's growing role in space policy now. The federal government is taking a step back at this. The private sector is filling in those areas, but not only the U.S. China and some other countries are also getting heavily involved in space exploration, and we want to find out what's happening there and what that future might mean for us. So stay with us. We'll come back on Point of View with Dan Garretson.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And I'm excited about this hour because we're going to be talking about space policy with Dr. Dan Garretson. He got his degree in physics from Caltech and a PhD in astronomy from Harvard University. And Dan has been working on space policy for some time, especially the private sector's growing role in space exploration right now. That's sort of leading the way for us. He's particularly focused on issues the effective use of data and analytics and data visualization. I'll get that out to assess and elucidate policy changes. And he is the CEO of Global Fact-Base. That's a logistics-focused data analytics and workflow automation platform. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Right?
Big mouthful there.
My pleasure, though. Thanks for having me.
Bigger than a mouthful, it's a big mindful.
All right, I'll take your word for it.
So we're talking about space at this particular point. And you and I, and you're a research fellow at the Institute for Policy Innovation, where I am, so we have a connection there. But things with space, you know, we went for years with the country heavily involved in space. We then sort of backed away a little bit. We had the space shuttle. It seemed kind of ho-hum a little bit with the space shuttle there.
Became routine almost.
It became very routine.
Until it wasn't.
And then we ended the space shuttle program, about 2011, 2012? Or
yep,
something
2011
like that.
was the final flight. It was announced in, I think, 2003.
And then we started using Russian rockets to fly to the International Space Station.
Yep.
So tell me, let's start off, how did you get interested in space?
Well, it was, probably the typical American boy kind of thing. Everybody wants to be an astronaut when they grow up, and that would be me as well. So, read science fiction as a kid, thoroughly.
Don't still do that?
I do, actually, when I can find time. That's the problem, finding time to read stuff for fun these days. But yeah, no, it's so just very much grew up and, really did want to be an astronaut for a long time. Got very interested in questions of, science in particular, so physics, astronomy, early universe kinds of issues. So that really drove my interest. So I went off to college and studied physics primarily.
At Caltech?
At Caltech, that's right. And actually did intend, kind of went in still thinking I would kind of tailor things to become more of an astronaut. I was actually focused on astronautical engineering at first before shifting over to more of a physics. And it was my freshman year, actually, January of my freshman year, when the Challenger explosion occurred. And that was certainly... I wouldn't say that scared me away per se, but it was kind of, it was like, yeah, how real is the investment going to be there kind of thing?
Right.
And should I actually tailor my activities towards focusing on that or just let it happen if it does? So kind of focused much more on the science side of things and continued to be interested in astronomy and kind of how the universe came to be and move forward and so forth. And then, but kind of as I finished up my graduate program, got actually lured away by the siren song of business, shall we say, and some of the activities in that space. But have continued to focus on technology, did a lot of work in the science and technology arena. So I was actually in the Washington, D.C. area for a number of years, working for something called the Science and Technology Policy Institute, where part of my portfolio was actually space. So did a lot of work there.
You were never tempted to, even if you said, I'm not going to be an astronaut, but an awful lot of people went as engineers and physicists and astronomers to NASA to be able to work on the space, our space program. Were you ever tempted to do that?
That was tempting. So that, certainly as I was going through grad school, a lot of the focus was on, an academic role, or at some of the national labs focused on science, astronomy, some of the, astronomy missions, that kind of thing. I would have been much more focused on the telescopes than on the rovers and such. But so, yes, I was definitely very interested in that. It's probably a longer story, but if you're interested, part of what ultimately sort of led me to trying out business and sort of focusing there a little bit. Kind of why things happen, how they happen, how we got here.
Which is what physicists do.
Which is what physicists do, exactly. Either that, or what I also discovered in grad school was a lot of physicists just love to solve really challenging problems, which, nothing wrong with that. That's, they have a lot of great fun with that. But theory was, I felt like we had a pretty good handle on the universe given the data that we had at the time, and things have evolved since. And don't get me wrong, but we have a pretty good sense of the overall outline. And so I kind of thought, no, I'll try a new challenge for a while.
So we started out. America started out in the 50s. We started working on the ability to be able to get into space. Then the Russians sent up Sputnik in October 4, 1957, if I remember correctly, and that changed the momentum completely because now people are concerned. And also the Russians are beating us, and we want. And this is not just a pride of country, but it's a pride of capitalism versus communism, I think.
And I think there was a real fear, frankly, of kind of now they've got the enemy overhead. And potentially able to bring weaponry to space and all the rest. So I think there was that as well.
NASA created the Mercury. They created NASA, and then they went out and got the Mercury 7, the 7 astronauts who were going to be the first part of that.
Yep.
They started going up initially with Alan Shepard, and then going through John Glenn, Gordon Cooper, and the others.
Although don't forget they were beat by Yuri Gagarin.
Oh yeah, Yuri Gagarin got up there first.
Exactly.
Beat him by 3 or 4 weeks, I think. If I remember, a month or so.
So almost a month. Yeah. So it was April versus May for Alan Shepard. So
and then at that particular time, President Kennedy comes out and says we want to take us to the moon by the end of the decade, which a lot of people thought that's probably not going to happen. And lo and behold, it did happen.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that today, given all the overruns and delays and so forth, that somehow they did it.
Yeah. So they managed to get us there. And but after that, we went to the moon several times.
Yep.
That seemed to get, I was around watching that. That seemed to get a little boring. It wasn't nearly as exciting as that first time in July of '69.
Yep.
But then other things come in. Space program sort of takes a back seat. It seems like we go to the shuttle. You got Skylab that was put up.
Yeah, it was Skylab, and you had Apollo Soyuz, so it became something of a peace kind of initiative there.
And then the International Space Station.
Yep. So although that didn't start till probably 20 years later.
Right. And so we're using the international. We're going up to the International Space Station. We're using the shuttle to get us up there.
Yep.
But then, as we mentioned, President Obama says we're going to begin ending this program and moving to something else and bringing in the private sector a little more.
Actually, it was Bush. It was President Bush.
I thought it was Obama. Okay.
So President Bush. So the big precipitating event was the Columbia disaster in 2003 to 2002, I think. Anyway, right around there, right as I was actually moving to DC to move into the policy world, and that kind of sparked a whole sort of initiative to reevaluate the space program. The shuttle was exorbitantly expensive. Never met some of the design targets for sort of turnaround time or cost. And so they decided to mothball it by at that point, I guess it was by the end of the decade. It ended up going into 2011.
When we come back from the break, I want to talk about how we now made a transition over to bringing the private sector in and getting that involved, and just the benefits we're seeing from the private sector in the space program. My guest for this hour, Dr. Dan Garretson. We're talking about space and space policy. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
President Biden pledged to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of this decade and to reach a goal of carbon zero by 2050. Even if we assume that it is necessary to address climate change, what would be the impact on our country? Anyone who criticizes such measures is usually tagged as a climate change denier. But David Harsanyi talks about another denial. He refers to it as Biden's climate denialism. The president and his policymakers are in denial about what it would take to hit such targets. Here are a few facts. Most of America's energy is generated by fossil fuels and nuclear. A much smaller amount comes from renewable sources such as wind, solar, and hydropower. We aren't going to reach the administration's goals by merely walking, riding bicycles, and turning down our thermostats. It will require that we eliminate gas-powered cars, retrofit homes and buildings, and rebuild the nation's electrical grid. Here's another way to look at the immensity of the problem. The pandemic and lockdown last year did reduce our country's greenhouse emissions. The best estimate is that it only reduced carbon emissions by 5%. You can imagine what a 50% reduction would entail. Of course, this country actually only accounts for about 15% of global CO2 emissions. Also, emissions in the U.S. and Europe have been falling since 2005. By contrast, the rising emissions from China have swamped these declines, and China is building more coal-fired plants every day. Proponents say the president's goals are technologically feasible and well within our reach. That is simply not true. It will be hugely expensive and massively disruptive. The president is in denial about the magnitude of his climate goal. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and with me in studio, Dr. Dan Garretson, who is a PhD in astronomy from Harvard, and we're talking about space policy. So we were going through sort of the history here, and you mentioned George W. Bush is the one who ultimately put the cancellation on the space shuttle, I guess.
That's
and
correct.
What was the reason behind that?
So it was right after the Columbia disaster, already the space shuttle had not really achieved a lot of its operational targets. It was much longer turnaround times than originally expected, much higher cost. I think it was about $500 million per launch. Ultimately, when you sort of factor in all the costs for operating the space shuttle. So it's just an incredibly expensive program. And they were looking at ways to really start to reframe the vision. The team at that point, and I joined right after they put the vision in place, so I was helping with some of the policy issues that came after. But I know a lot of the discussion was around, we're basically going to low Earth orbit. We haven't been back to the moon in, at that point, I guess it was about 30 years, 20 years. No, it was actually almost 30 years. And so we're just hanging out in low Earth orbit. What are we doing? And so the thought was, the shuttle is actually, rather than being a help to space exploration, was hindering it. It was sucking up costs. It could go elsewhere. We're already moving down the path with the space station. So, there were thoughts about how do we continue to support that? Do we just let it deorbit? Whatever. But ultimately stuck with that. But the issue was, let's create a new vision that is basically the moon, Mars, and beyond. And the way they framed it was, it's kind of a pay-as-you-go mission. So we're not going to sort of devote a huge amount of budget to an Apollo moonshot type program. We're going to sort of incrementally build capability as we get to, more and more operations in space, operations on the moon, and then from there staging for Mars.
And when did the International Space Station come in?
So the International Space Station, I think construction started in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say early 90s. So that was something that was in the works for probably 10, 20. I think probably even since the cancellation of the Moon program, but Apollo program. But the construction actually started in the 90s.
And just for our listeners who might not know this, but back in the 50s, early 60s, the general expectation was we were going to first build a space station circling the Earth. And if you were listening to Dr. Werner von Braun, Herman Oberth, Willie Lay, and all those people who were out there talking. Disney even did something like this. Walt Disney did for the
I think everybody,
world of Disney.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody with kind of that futuristic vision has done something on this.
And you saw this circling spaceship that looked kind of like a wheel, which in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the movie, they used something like that. Mm-hmm. And the expectation had been this would be circling the Earth, and we would be able to go there, get in a rocket, and go from there to the Moon or Mars or other things. So was the notion by going to this incremental thing an attempt to try? We didn't do that in our effort to get to the Moon initially, but are we coming back to that sort of thinking now that we have a space station that will eventually be sort of a platform for being able to go to other places?
Yeah, I think that pretty much characterizes the current situation. Is it's much more of that building capability. The way to think about it is, there's kind of been two different mindsets for thinking about space development. One is let's build capability and then sort of incrementally build from there, and the other is no, let's just sort of do the big programs. That's going to generate the excitement, and then we'll sort of fill in behind with capability to support it. And I think those two trends have been competing with each other throughout the program. But it's kind of evolved back into a let's definitely build capability and stay there and keep building on that.
U.S. astronauts just returned yesterday, I think, from the space station on
That's right.
the Dragon. What do they call it?
The Dragon capsule. Yeah,
the Dragon capsule.
Yeah, Dragon Crew 2.
That's a private sector deal. That's Elon Musk, is it not? Is that SpaceX?
That's right. So that was the way to think about some of those programs. You've got the traditional contracting model that the government has always done, which is specify exactly what they want and contract for it. Whereas with SpaceX, it was private capital provided the investment up front, and then it was sort of pay for services going forward.
So when did the private sector start getting involved in real space exploration?
So that depends on how you define it, right? So the private sector has been involved in space, for a long time. Communication satellites, Earth observing, et cetera. Where things really started to change, I think, was kind of in the early 2000s, as we started to frame this, Moon, Mars, and Beyond vision. And the thought was, how do we start to change the contracting model so that we can take advantage of private sector competition, get private sector more engaged in defining, approaches, exploring different ways of doing things, sort of loosen up the way the terms were defined for contracting. So that was really around space launch in particular, but there was a lot around, in general, building lunar capability or building space station supply. And in fact, the whole shift from shutting down the shuttle to trying to find ways to keep resupplying the station was about starting to try to take advantage of the private sector and build up that capability.
When I saw on the news last night the Dragon capsule going away, and they show a picture of the astronaut sitting inside, and anybody who's looked at the picture of the capsules going to the moon from the 1960s, you look at that and think, this is it's just fundamentally so much different. This looks like a sort of a modern place that I wouldn't mind being in.
Right, screens rather than switches, and
it looks clean. It looks modern. It just looks very, very neat. Is that just the private sector getting involved, or is that just technology that's been able to evolve?
I think there's probably a little bit of both. There's certainly there's sort of design elements that have emerged that have become more possible over the last 30 years of information technology development, 30 plus, and so that's really creating opportunities, the big screens, the opportunities to sort of improve visual display, visual interaction, visual cues. But then also I think there's a private sector element. It's not a Spartan. Make it a little more of a kind of pleasant viewing.
It looks
thing.
a little more appealing.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
For those, is it Blue Origin that's going to do the low orbit trips for private sector people, just general public that wants to do it?
Yeah, there's been a couple of Virgin Galactic as well. So Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin are both looking at suborbital flights.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, joyrides up to the edge of space, get a few minutes of weightlessness, and then come back down. It's a much easier problem than going into orbit. But
it's easier, but it's not cheap.
It's still not cheap. Much cheaper than going into orbit, but still not cheap.
But you've got people who've already been signing up for that and putting in their money for it, I believe.
Yeah, when Virgin Galactic won the SpaceX or the Space Prize, X Prize competition, I want to say 2005, might have been 2004. I thought they would be operating sort of joyrides within a few years. It's amazing it's taken about 15 years, but it looks like they're finally about to get to the point of starting to do it. And Blue Origin just announced, I want to say in the last few days, that they were starting to take reservations for some of the flights as well. So things are moving forward there.
Save your money.
Save your money. It is pretty, hitting on just even the last weekend, let alone the last few weeks or so, where it's just a lot of different activity. You've had the Chinese launch of their space station. You've had the Dragon crew capsule returning first, I think nighttime splashdown in since the Apollo program. So it's.
I saw that, and I wondered why did they do it at night? Just because that's the way it worked out?
I think there's probably some of that, but also proof of ability, capability there, because you're going to need to have that kind of flexible operating capabilities going forward. So.
Now the Russians would bring theirs back and bring their astronauts back and land on land, I believe, most of the time, and we're still dropping in the water. So why the difference?
I think probably more, I don't have, this is a speculation on my part, but I think it's probably just, operationally easier. You don't have to worry about sort of the landing structure being able to deal with the hard surface landing. A little bit more padding, shall we say, and so forth, then you just sort of don't have to worry about where it lands either. So, you've got a large stretch of ocean. You're not worried about land interference, land obstacles that it might run into.
And the three major companies that are working on actually taking people in space, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, are there some others that are getting close to that?
There are some others. So they're probably, Blue Origin and SpaceX are the main ones working on orbital flight. You do have Boeing also doing stuff. So Boeing is actually doing some space station resupply. I don't know if they're looking at transportation as much. The main ones, tourism as such, but the main ones doing that are like SpaceX and Blue Origin. Where Virgin Galactic fits is squarely in that suborbital space. You also have a few other companies. There's Sierra Nevada Corporation that's built their space plane capability or working on it. A few others working on launch, but Blue Origin and SpaceX are the big ones. And, Blue Origin hasn't yet flown an orbital mission. So it really is SpaceX at the point. The Rocket Lab also has done some orbital missions. They're more smaller payloads and satellites. So not real people, but, SpaceX, and then, of course, the traditional players.
My guest for this hour is Dr. Dan Garretson. We're talking about space policy and the private sector getting involved in this. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Dan. 1-800-351-1212 if you have a comment or a question about for Dan and what's happening in the U.S. Space policy. It's an amazing thing now that the private sector is involved. We're seeing lots of churn and things going on that we might not have thought we would see for a long time, but yet it's happening now because you've got some good minds and some private sector involved. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a second on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we're talking with Dr. Dan Garretson about space policy. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to ask Dan a question or have a comment. 1-800-351-1212. And Dan, we mentioned about some of the innovation that's going on. And the private sector is just doing things I'd never really thought or even considered. I mean, you've got SpaceX that has the first stage now coming back to Earth.
Yep.
And at first, I think they were dropping it in the water and then capturing. Now it actually comes and lands back on the pad.
Yep.
So they can just go put the second, third stage, or fourth stage back on. So give us an idea of some of the innovations that are emerging from companies that have a financial interest in trying to keep costs as low as possible in order to make this work.
Yeah. So the reusability idea is actually was a large part of the shuttle program as well. So it actually did start there. So the shuttle was reusable, the solid rocket boosters. What I think SpaceX has done is they've made it much more operational. I mean, it's been a dream of the space program forever, and the reason is, I mean, think about if you had to build your automobile every time you go to the grocery store and throw it out and then get a new one. Probably not going to work. So,
and that's actually a point, because in the early days in the science fiction that we talked about earlier, in the movies, the spaceships would take off from Earth. They would land still fully formed on the moon or some other station, and they would turn around in space somewhere and land, and then they take off and come back to the Earth. So you didn't even there was a sort of sense that the whole ship should be there, but that's not the way it developed, and I assume rightly so, just because you're trying to shed weight.
That's right. I mean, well, so when they take off, I think something close to 90% of the rocket is fuel. Mm-hmm. So it is almost entirely fuel to get things into space, and so you basically you kind of throw away the tank as you go along, different parts of the tank, just to lighten the weight, so you don't take it all the way to orbit, because just not necessary. And even with the SpaceX concept, I mean, that the first stage doesn't go to orbit, but it does, they have made it recoverable. So at least they can save the cost of having to rebuild it every time.
And it saves time as well, doesn't it?
That's right. So they can basically refurbish it. With the shuttle, it's not clear that it saved time, because they in some ways redid the entire heat shield every launch. Completely disassembled and reassembled the solid rocket boosters and so forth. Where I think SpaceX and certainly with some of the new concepts that are coming out of the Starship and then the New Glenn concepts from Blue Origin, the idea is that is much more rapid turnaround, so much more really reusable, basically.
Are there some other innovations that we think, oh my, that's an amazing thing that the private sector has been able to bring in?
So I think, there's a couple of technology innovations and there's a bunch of business model innovations. On the technology side, actually, it's turned out, I think it was just kind of the way the design progressed, but it's turned out to be a helpful innovation for them as well. The Falcon 9 has engine out capability. So one of the engine fails on the way up, it can still achieve orbit. So there's a lot of sort of redundancy that they built in as a result of that. But I think the big thing for them also is just an innovative approach to how they thought about it. The space program over the years had gotten into a sort of this basic approach where they had to get everything right. So in some sense, a lot of the traditional players couldn't do a test that had any chance of failure. So basically, if you're mitigating all risk of failure before you do the test, then what's the point of the test at some level? Whereas the SpaceX approach, he brought a much more of a Silicon Valley mindset of test and learn, test and learn, test and learn. If you blow up a few rocket engines, if you blow up a few test stands along the way, well, you probably learned something. So that kind of innovation around contractors and how you manage the overall contracting process. And the whole idea for the space program itself of having multiple suppliers and sort of leveraging the competition among the suppliers to be able to provide the services.
Now, getting into space is a challenge in and of itself, both for gravity. You're up there, there's no air.
Space is hard.
Space is hard. You actually have a joke about that. I asked you one time about people who invest in that, and your response was...
Yeah, it's the common joke is, what's the best way to become a millionaire in space launch? Well, you got to start out as a billionaire.
But there's other challenges now, especially since we've been up there. There's space waste and other things. So what are some of the additional challenges that we're finding?
Yeah, so I mean, the space waste is an element of, we've had so much stuff over the last what is it now, 70 years of space launch activities, not quite, I guess 60 years of space launch activity. You've got stuff left in orbit, satellites that have burned out. Now most of the stuff in very low Earth orbit has deorbited. So you're in outer space, but there's still at the lower end there, you still have enough drag that you slowly slow things down. But as you get up, space station levels and above, a lot of that stuff is not going to deorbit anytime soon.
And space station levels 125, 150 miles up?
Closer to 300 miles.
Oh, is that high? Okay.
So yeah, so it's a bit higher. I don't remember the exact altitude, but it's not quite the extreme low Earth. Just again because of the drag potentially slowing it down, so it gets it up out of that.
I listened to a company CEO who is wanting to get involved in pulling out some of the waste in space. What are we looking at trying to do there? I mean, because you've got a lot of things. You've got former, I guess, rocket shells, satellites that are no longer working,
dropped wrenches,
all kinds of things. And in the early days, they were worried about micrometeors and things of this nature. Now you've got really big stuff that are out there.
Yep. I mean, the saving grace is, and people don't often realize that space is just big. I mean, there is just so much space up there. You're talking about a bullet hitting a bullet in a very large expanse. That said, you get enough stuff up there, there's still a reasonable probability that's going to happen at some point.
There's been a few times where they've had the space station or rockets have had to move a little bit, right?
Yeah, they've had to shelter in the space station in certain protected areas and kind of move the space station up or down or kind of out of the way. Yeah, that has happened.
Now, you mentioned the Chinese a minute ago, and they're getting started on their own space station, right? They're not going to play with us on our space station?
That's right. They launched, I think April was the first major component was launched into space. So actually, this has been a big month, or I guess last month. Lots of activity going on. It's amazing the amount of acceleration of activity. They're targeting, I believe it's 24 or 25, something like that, for having basically a completed space station. So they're doing a number of missions over the coming years.
Will it be larger than the space station, the International Space Station? Because, I mean, typically the idea had been that you'd have a big space station, the size of a wheel, it would circle around so that you could have artificial gravity in there from the wheel circulating and so forth. Do we have any idea what the Chinese have in mind?
My understanding is it's quite a bit smaller. I don't know the exact numbers, but I've heard something like 20% of the size of the space station. So about a fifth
of the current space station.
Of the current space station, the ISS. Yeah. So it'll be quite a bit smaller. Is my understanding of what they're targeting. They've got a pretty aggressive sort of science agenda. So doing a lot of experiments, a lot of work in this space, but.
And they have sent some rockets to the moon, have they not, to do some surveillance and other things?
That's right. I believe they've orbited. Trying to remember if they've landed. But they're investing heavily in sort of developing their own space program and getting resources into space. So.
And because the Chinese are we'll say a competitor right now, but could be a foe at some point.
Yep.
What's the concern about space becoming a tool for military policy and going back to the 1950s where people were afraid that countries would use space as a way to attack them or see them? What's the concern there?
So, I think that ship has sailed at some level. So, space has almost been a tool of the military from the start. Now, not necessarily weapons, which I know is kind of what you're getting at, but it's been surveillance. Communications obviously is a kind of a first thing, but surveillance, a major capability of space. So, military has been there from day one. There's always been thoughts about putting nuclear weapons in space, and lots of concern about that. So, thankfully, a lot of controls in place, treaties in place to stop that. I think it's once you get something in space, so if you think about ballistic missile launch, it's about a 30-minute window to from launch to hitting the U.S. versus if it's something in space and you just sort of have the weapon there already, it could be a matter of a few minutes, 10 minutes or so, so your response time, your ability to react is just that much less. So that's of course the concern. And the idea is let's try to keep the weapons out of space as much as possible, particularly mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons and such. Thankfully, I think saner heads have stayed in the loop on this, and we haven't put nuclear weapons in space.
That we know of.
That we know. Yes, fair point. Fair point. But, at some level, It's probably a bit of an inevitability, right? So hopefully not anytime, and probably not in our lifetime. I would be hopeful, but
well, that will raise some questions about treaties and international treaties, and we have a few. So when we come back, we want to talk a little bit about some of those treaties and how we might try to ensure the safety of space, as well as the ability to be able for countries to be able to continue working in there compatibly.
Yep.
My guest for this hour, Dr. Dan Garretson, and we're talking about space policy. If you want to know more about Dan, we have a link to him and his organization and a short bio of him on the Point of View website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to talk a bit about the prospects for treaties and for using space for other things, exploration, mineral rights, and other things of that nature, all of which might fall under the realm of a treaty. This is Point of View. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back for our final segment with Dr. Dan Garretson as we talk about space policy. So, Dan, there have been a couple of international agreements, if I recall correctly, one in the 1960s, I believe, and I think one after that. And it was a way to try to say we're all going to work harmoniously in space, and we're not going to militarize space, and we're gonna all hold together and sing Kumbaya. So how are those agreements working? Are they still in effect? Do we need something different? And even if we get a international agreement from various countries, does it actually make a difference?
Yeah, great questions. The first treaty that you're referring to in the 60s is often referred to as the Outer Space Treaty, and it's got a much longer name that I never remember. But and that had various principles in it, including non-deployment of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. So very important aspect there. I think the thing that I see that's a bit challenging about it is it views space as something that is always going to be the domain of governments to control. Doesn't really think about non-state actors and what they might do unless they're under the auspices of the government, really directing their activities. So there's questions of appropriation of resources. There's questions of dealing with assisting other astronauts in distress or return of astronauts and things like that. All important issues. But doesn't really take into account what it might take to actually incent the development of space or deal with the things like tragedies of the commons, and how people will actually pay to invest in space and develop it. And there's the second treaty that actually the U.S. was never a signatory. That's really significant. Is something called the Moon Treaty. And that in particular really raised the ante on sort of treating this as the common heritage of mankind and resources that need to be preserved for everybody to use, all scientific information shared and all the rest. And I just think, from the perspective of somebody who would like to see space develop, that's just not realistic. Now, if your goal is to really truly preserve space as a pristine environment, maybe, but good luck with that, particularly as space companies really invest more and more heavily in developing the resources. They're going to want a return on their investment. They're not going to go out and sort of capture an asteroid and expect that it's, that they don't have the right to then own it and take advantage of its resources for themselves.
So we generally think there are, say, minerals on the moon, and we're looking at going back to the moon. If a company sends a rocket to the moon, are they allowed to start mining resources? Let's just say that's technically feasible. We'll assume that for a second. Are they able to start mining resources, bringing those resources back, or would they hit the treaty and then there would be complications?
So there's interesting questions of kind of what the sovereignty rights are for nations in the treaty. So the Outer Space Treaty in particular talks about nations declaring sovereignty, but at the same time, or sort of appropriating resources. But it's a little bit more ambiguous when you start talking about non-state actors like companies and so forth. And what does it mean to appropriate or own it? There's some open questions there. There's something called the Artemis Accords that are being developed right now. That's in support of the Artemis program, which is the return to the moon for 2024. Where it's a little more, I think, all about shared ownership. I think those are going to be hard to enforce. Particularly as companies, if they invest all the effort in getting to it, they're going to demand the right to be able to take advantage of the resources that they invested all the money in capturing.
We don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to take Benjamin's comment from Georgia about the issue of aliens. If we are moving out into space, are we going to see aliens in there? There have been I think the government recently started releasing UFO sightings or something that the Navy had or something of that nature. Is there any reason that we know of right now to believe there are aliens? I remember when we first sent the first it was a camera to Mars. Was it Voyager to Mars? It was years ago, back in the 70s, I believe it was.
Yep.
And we landed there.
The green canals that people were talking about.
They was able to take a few pictures, and I remember listening to a person on a talk radio show say, well, the reason they didn't find Martians there is because they didn't land the ship where the Martians were.
Right.
So is there I haven't seen any reason to believe there are aliens out there, but it raises the possibility.
So, from my perspective, aliens are probably out there in some form, whether that's sort of monocellular life somewhere and so forth. But the question is where, right? The universe is enormous. And so, the nearest galaxy is a couple million light years away. And then, go for billions of light years beyond that. There's just a lot of space out there. So I suspect there's life of some sort. Multicellular life turns out to be probably very hard to get to. So is that anywhere close to us? What are the numbers there? There's all sorts of speculations on that. My suspicion is that you haven't seen aliens really come to the Earth, to get a little more focused. So I've seen nothing that sort of makes me doubt that. And just when you think about the distances involved, the energy requirements in traveling from one star system to another, it's just not very likely. On the other hand, could there be, single cellular life on even some other places in the solar system? Actually, there's a really good chance there, and they probably came from Earth, to be honest. But
well, they're looking. I mean, when they get on Mars, they say we're looking very hard to see if there is any evidence of water some billion years ago, and so therefore there might have been some microbes or something.
It's a long chain of causal processes, but certainly don't expect to find intelligent life. You might find at best monocellular life or something of that sort, and potentially even contamination from the Earth. I mean, some of this gets kicked up into space over time. You've got all sorts of biological material thrown up. So wouldn't be surprised, but I would not expect to see aliens or alien life. I mean, we've been looking for decades now to find evidence of intelligent life and haven't even found anything.
In Washington.
Well, not even in Washington. That's another problem. But yes, nothing out there that's any real evidence of intelligent life out there in the universe.
So are we going to? Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. He's not just settling for the moon. He wants to move on to Mars.
Yep.
What do you think the chances of that? And if so, how long are we talking about?
So I think interestingly, there's a ton of challenges that I think aren't widely recognized about getting to Mars. I mean, even the moon is a much more I wouldn't say hospitable environment. At the end of the day, Mars itself is more hospitable, but you've got the sort of region between the planets. There, you're just awash in radiation of different sorts, interstellar radiation. So all sorts of particle emissions that you need to worry about. So that needs to be solved. I think that'll be solved. There's some people that say, it'll never be possible for humans to go there. I'm a little more optimistic than that. I think people can put their minds to it and be very ingenious and come up with great ideas, and I think they'll make it.
Well, Elon Musk has been phenomenal in being able to bring things to the front that we weren't sure he would be able to do, though oftentimes on a delayed time scale.
Yes, he has learned the whole sort of Silicon Valley lesson of market often, market loudly, and if your deadline slips, so well. But yes, they're moving things fast. I think they will definitely get there probably in the next. Is it 5 or 10 years? Is it 10 to 20 years? It's probably more in the 10 to 20 years likely than the 5 to 10, but it'll happen.
He's bought Bitcoin. If it keeps going up, he may have all the funding he needs to get there.
Yeah, although I think that's a small part of his fortune at the moment.
Right now, but maybe not for long.
Maybe not for long. I think that's right.
My guest for this hour has been Dr. Dan Garretson. He is he's a research fellow with the Institute for Policy Innovation, where I'm associated, but he also has his own website there and data analytics firm that he has information on. So if you want to find out more about Dan, go to pointofview.net. You will find you'll have a link to that, his website and other things, and information on him. I'll be back tomorrow, and tomorrow we're going to be looking at an interesting deal, the pig book from the Council Against Government Waste. The pig book started by Senator Tom Coburn years ago, Finding Waste in Washington. So I'll be interested to bring you that information, and thank you for joining us for this hour. I'm Merrill Matthews, and we'll be back with Point of View tomorrow.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's